Well, I'm very glad to hear that you all applauded as instructed off the back of that. It's time for our next session now. I'm Julie Etchingham from ITV News, and it's really a great pleasure to welcome back to RTS Cambridge the Chief Exec of Ofcom, Sharon White, for her final appearance in that role. First outing in front of a TV industry audience was to RTS Cambridge 4 years ago. Sharon, happily you've returned every year to take questions and to be interviewed. As you know, Sharon leaves Ofcom at the end of the year to take up a new role of chairman of the John Lewis partnership. Insert joke here about never knowingly undersold. She's heard them all by now. But under her watch, Ofcom has overseen everything from the sale of Sky, navigated the separation of BT's Openreach broadband operation, becoming the first external regulator of the BBC. She's had to deal with the growing impact of streaming video on demand, taken on interim regulation of online harm, launched a review of PSB, and perhaps her defining mission to increase diversity among the TV workforce. So you're just a bit knackered, Sharon.
Oh my God, I can't think like if I'd had any idea, I think, when I'd applied for the job that was the last 4 years. I think I'd been too scared ever to have put in my CV.
So let's focus straight away on the issue of diversity among the TV workforce, because you've launched your third report into that today, headlining on breaking the class ceiling, the social makeup of the TV industry revealed. Now, you've only just started gathering data on this, but the top line is that if you work for the BBC, if you work in the TV industry, you're twice as likely to have been to a private school. You can't tell me that you're terribly surprised by that, presumably.
No, I mean, it's interesting. We've been having a conversation. I think every RTS I've been to over the last few years, this has been a big topic. It's our third report, as you say, Julie. And I mean, it's, you know, if you're the glass half full version of this is that we know. You know, we spent a lot of years thinking, well, do we have the information and do we have the data? Actually, the picture's really clear. Whether it's for senior women in the business or for people from an ethnic minority background, or now, as you say, it's not a huge surprise that TV industry is much more represented amongst people with professional backgrounds or private schools. And over the last 3 years of having the information out there, the dial hasn't shifted. The numbers haven't changed. But I think there's more of a conversation, and certainly I think, you know, when I talk to Caroline or Alex at Channel 4, I think the intent from the leadership of the broadcasters is definitely more acute, but we're obviously not doing enough.
Well, I'm just wondering, on whose side is the greater failure? I mean, you were obviously very keen. It was your sort of defining mission when you first came to RTS Cambridge that you really wanted to hold the industry's feet to the fire on this. And the industry said, yes, we are taking this on board. Yes, we are putting programs in place. But, you know, I mean, in this report, you are saying there has been no discernible change in the TV industry's diversity profile. I mean, where do you put the blame for that? And do you acknowledge some of that yourself, perhaps?
I mean, I think, you know, moving the dial on representation and diversity, I think, is very much, I mean, it's very much a collective effort. I mean, clearly, you know, I'd love to be in a position, I think all of us, where, you know, where the diversity and the makeup of the industry had moved more significantly. We're 3 years in. I think the role of the regulator, which I think is incredibly important, is to put sunshine and to put a spotlight into where the gaps are. I think all of this is going to take much, much more concerted leadership and effort, because...
Do you think it might shift a bit more quickly than it?
Oh yeah, I mean, as I say, I'm a very optimistic, just very optimistic by temperament, and absolutely, I thought 2 or 3 years in we'd start to see some shift. Not least because, you know, all of us can think about, you know, numbers of initiatives in our own companies and in the broadcasters. I mean, I could name a number of them, and I think there's a question about whether some of those initiatives and some of those activities are actually sufficiently in the grain and sufficiently in the mainstream of the culture of how we're recruiting and promoting from within. So there are lots of, you know, fantastic, you know, whether there are writers' programs or directors' programs for people coming through. But actually, as we're developing our core talent, is the fact of having greater representation something that's absolutely at the forefront of all of our minds. And I think what the data shows today is clearly, it's clearly a long way to go.
It's a long way to go. But I mean, the focus this year clearly is around social mobility, yes, social inclusion. But I mean, how can you realistically hope the industry will address this when it can't address basic equality between men and women? I mean, the proportion of women in the TV industry has fallen to 45% compared to 47% in the general population.
I mean, I think it's, social mobility is obviously is a harder area. Even, I'm sure there are different views, amongst the audience, even in terms of how you measure this. And we've tried for the first year, actually with a lot of help from the Bridge Group, to start to get into the skin of this. Whether it's backgrounds from free school meals or professional class of your family when you hit primary, secondary school. So it's a harder area, but I would say it's part of the same puzzle, which is do we think that we are going to produce better quality programming that resonates more with audiences, that grips and grabs and engages, if the quality of our programme is representative and authentic and real for our full range of audiences. And we know what audiences want. I mean, this is in the context of the Netflix and Amazon debate, is British content that resonates. And we also know that audiences say that actually for lots of communities, particularly outside London, the content isn't strong enough. So there should be a huge spur, I think, from producers and broadcasters and, yes, of course, the regulator in the room, to get representation much broader, because it's about the quality of our output.
Now, in the report, you're saying you're going to be seeking, you want Ofcom to seek more powers. Yes. It won't be quite on your watch. You've got the Secretary of State coming next. And it's been clear from the DCMS that they are minded to help Ofcom gather the data on this, yeah, for action. So precisely what powers are you looking for? Yes, what would you say to...
Nick is in the front row, so she may say more about this. I mean, at the moment, I think as many people know, we have got powers by law to require the companies that have licenses with Ofcom for gender, age and ethnicity, which is fantastic. And we've had a lot of conversations with the broadcasters to collect on a voluntary basis a much broader set of information, from social mobility this year to sexuality, sexual orientation and so on. But that's very much, it's been a voluntary engagement. Lots of broadcasters have been fantastic and have really been part of that. But we'd love to get to a position where we're able to collect a much broader set of information on an obligatory basis, and so that will take legislation. Some
secondary legislation to
that will take some legislation.
Yeah.
And a big issue is obviously the freelance community as well, because lots of us, for lots of us, our employment is not the permanent workforce, it's freelancers, and it would be great to have the ability to collect that data on a more systematic basis.
And actually, that would paint a fairer picture in the end of the entire industry, because there are whole swathes of it that are actually beyond your remit.
No, completely. And I think some broadcasters, more than 50% of the workforce is composed of freelancers. It's just the nature of the dynamic and flexible nature of the industry.
I suppose from a broadcaster's perspective, I mean, I just know it from a newsroom perspective, where we've just been on non-stop for 3 years, slightly more than 3 years actually, trying to keep diversity in mind the whole of the time, when, particularly in a newsroom arena, we've been up against it for a long time. Also, so that's one challenge. Another challenge is actually people being ready to disclose the information that you're seeking, and perhaps particularly when we're talking about socioeconomic background, you are dependent on people being willing to actually volunteer the information.
Yes, and we know that people are much more willing if they think there's going to be some positive outcome for that. But I think even the way you frame diversity as being something that being in a busy newsroom you might be too busy for, I think is a reflection of part of the challenge. If we see diversity as some sort of, tick box exercise of political correctness because, the regulator once a year is going to produce some league tables, we might as well shut up shop.
Well, I have to say, I know that my newsroom has made plenty of efforts on this. I was just saying that against an extremely sort of pressured background, yes, particularly in news, it's always making time to take that on board.
Yeah, and I guess I'm saying if we believe that our news output or our drama or our non-scripted is going to resonate with our audiences more effectively because it's more representative, then the question about whether you're in a busy cycle or not is irrelevant, because it's absolutely core to producing brilliantly for audiences. So I think it's a mindset shift.
How's Ofcom doing on its own targets?
So we're making progress, but I think like everybody else in the industry, we also raise our hands. So we're doing well on gender, and we're doing well on gender at all levels in the organisation, including at senior levels. We're doing less well on ethnicity at senior levels, but starting to make some good progress. So I see us very much not as the sort of, the saints at the table or the angels, but it's a conversation, I think, that all of us have got things to learn from each other.
I mean, there's so much to talk to you about before we sort of release you from the industry, I suppose, and the industry conversation. But this was your sort of defining mission when you arrived here. What lesson have you learned from it? And would you perhaps want to hand on, not just in more powers, in a request for more powers, but in terms of...
Yes, I mean, as I say, I think we have come on in terms of the conversation. I think crucially, it's about concerted leadership that sees this as a core part of the business of running a successful broadcaster and a successful production company, and that it's not something that's driven as a mandated task by a regulator. I think that's a key thing. And I think for us as a regulator, I think there's more we can do to help the industry learn the lessons where there are successes, and to make those more widespread.
Let's broaden that out, because it's actually all part of the same piece, and talk about the review that you've begun of public service broadcasting. You've recognised, obviously, that we're at this crucial moment of unprecedented pressure on PSBs from the global on-demand internet services. Just give us a sense of the scale of what you think we're up against in the PSB sector.
Yeah, I think we're trying to do the next public service broadcasting review in a slightly different way from as usual. So there won't be a sort of the 2,000-page tome that arrives in a year's time. What we're trying to do is to have a much broader discussion with the industry, with the public, with young people. And I think some of the challenges, I think when I first came to Ofcom, we did our first PSB review under my watch in 2015. And the debate then was, is this a tipping point? Are young people really going to turn into middle-aged people? Are their habits going to change? And probably the single biggest thing that's happened in the last few years, which has been a big topic today, is the fundamental shift in viewing habits. And I think our data actually really underestimates that. So we look at 16 to 24-year-olds, halving of, as everybody knows, of live viewing over the last few years. The smartphone generation who are completely bypassing public service broadcasting. And I think that the challenge is that the content of the PSBs is so fantastic. The question is, how does it get distributed? I think the previous session, and how does it get marketed in a world in which young people aren't coming through channels? And I'm quite optimistic, and I think partly because the choice and the vibrancy for viewers is so extraordinary. The back catalogue for the PSBs, I look at BritBox as another great innovation to get more of the content out to viewers. I think with more innovation about distribution, I think actually the PSBs can more than survive but can thrive. But I think it's absolutely about being innovative about how the content gets out to viewers, particularly young people.
Because you've spoken very specifically about ensuring that PSB programmes and players are clearly visible on big platforms, online in particular.
Yeah, so some of you will have seen we did a piece of work just before the summer on prominence, really. How do we all ensure that when you switch on your smart TV that the first tile that starts to flash is not Amazon Prime, but is a PSB slate. And we passionately believe over the next few years this is really crucial to ensuring that public service broadcasting is easily found. Now, I'm afraid it's an area that we've sort of put into the Secretary of State's Interim, because there's going to need to be some, some legislation and some time in Parliament to prioritise this, and I think that's incredibly important.
Do you think that will be enough, though? I mean, would you be prepared to explore other areas, perhaps, where you could support the PSBs differently?
Yeah,
other countries have found different methods of it. They've put levies on the streamers that would then bankroll a production fund that could be, people could apply to from the PSB sector. There are other areas that you could be looking at if you're really determined to protect this.
No, I agree, but I think very much this is going to be a sort of partnership between the government and the regulator, to be frank. So I think for us, what is going to be most important is being able to try, with the support of the industry, to design a provenance regime that is actually going to work as the technology runs. So in a world of voice recognition, where we've all got Alexa devices, where there's very easy disintermediation, I think working with the industry to make sure that actually government have then got something that's very practical to put in place. My own view, this is probably more in the context of online regulation, is that there is a role for some levy on the online platforms to support core public service broadcasting. It's not an Ofcom view, but that's certainly my personal view, and ultimately it's really for the government to decide.
Yeah, that would be quite a radical moment, really, if your personal view was then taken up on that.
Yes, but I think it's, it feels to me that we've got about, there's 5 years, 6 years, really to try to get the discoverability and distribution of public service broadcasting in a way in which young people now coming through the smartphone generation, the recognition is there.
So 5 years or what? Basically, that sounds a bit, strikes quite a doom.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. No, I'm not doom-laden at all, but I think it's just the reality. If the evidence we've seen from some work we did with 12 to 15-year-olds, that their brand recognition, YouTube is highest, Netflix is next, Carolyn and ITV is third, and the BBC is some way down. So I think that it's not a question of the content being incredibly engaging, it's how do we ensure that over this next period, that it's as easy to find, it's as easy as to find some great piece of drama content or children's content as it is pressing a Netflix button on my Samsung TV.
And do you think you have any sense? I mean, we've both got kids actually about the same age. Do you think, from your experience, that generation has a sense of what a PSB even is? I mean, when you look at Amazon and Netflix, some of their content fits that PSB description pretty well in terms of its quality, in terms of some of the subject matter that it'll tackle. Do you think there's even a sense now that people get what PSB is?
I think it's interesting, even when we did our review 5 years ago, there's very little distinction between sort of content that's done by public service broadcasters and great content. So when we did lots of research and asking people, what do you think is the best PSB content? Often it was from the Netflix, even at that stage, or from a streamer, or from Discovery, or one of the straight commercial broadcasters. So I think in a diminishing way, there's a sense of what the compact is, that precious compact that we have in this country on public service broadcasting. So I think that's already starting to happen, that there's just less brand recognition. It's probably a bit different in news, where I think absolutely BBC, ITV, Channel 4, actually I think Sky, also Channel 5, there is a sense of the public service broadcasting as the place for sort of reliable, trusted, honest news content.
Let's just turn briefly to news and current affairs. I mean, what's the point of PSB? I mean, you could look at it as the absolute core service of PSB. I mean, what's the point of it if we have senior politicians who refuse to appear on it and who refuse to be interviewed by certain PSB outlets, shall I?
Well, I would say the news is even more, is much broader than that. I mean, of course, there's a reference to McTaggart lecture, and I was there, and of course, PSB News is incredibly important to our democracy and the scrutiny of our public figures. And of course, one supports as much public accountability of our elected politicians.
If you see it as part of our democratic conversation, you have senior political figures refusing to be scrutinised, bypassing it, using other platforms perhaps to directly communicate, which is all part of the landscape and is all well and good. But if it means that questions are being curated and proper, rigorous examination is not happening.
But I would say, well, I guess what I would say, if you talk to audiences about how they feel about PSB News, and we're doing a big review into the BBC's news content, actually what they're saying is that they find PSB News continues to be a highly trusted source, high honesty, and indeed when they go to social media, so they will, as we all do, we sort of, switch onto Twitter for breaking news, and the first thing they do is then go to the BBC or to ITV actually to check the reliability of that. And so the audiences, even without, the current debate about, politicians deciding to be interviewed or not, it's a very difficult political environment at the moment. Public service broadcasting news continues to be sort of hugely valued by audiences. But what we do find, and I think this is particularly when we've talked to viewers about the BBC, is whether they play it too safe. So actually what they want to see is more in-depth, more edgy reporting, particularly in current affairs. And there is this sense, again, it comes back to diversity and representation as to whether there is too much sort of Westminster bubble speaking to Westminster bubble. So actually, if you're in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland, actually the big issue for you is that the national news doesn't translate sufficiently to my local context. It may be a national story on the health service, but actually, what does that mean in my local area? Or if you're from an ethnic minority background, not feeling as engaged because the people in front of the screen don't come from the same communities as you. So I'm sort of less down, I have to say, because audiences probably have anything from any of the output of public service broadcasting. It's the news and current affairs that continues to be, very, very highly valued.
Let's turn from that to Ofcom's regulation of the BBC. This is one of these massive new undertakings that has happened under your watch. Took on that regulation in 2017. How's that sort of bedded down in your view? I mean, you've had a couple of testing moments, not least over the iPlayer, for example. Just give us your perspective on that.
No, it's been really...
Now you can almost let it all rip.
Yes, nice invitation. I have to say, it's been a really interesting few years, and I would say sort of relations at working level and personally are very good. I think there is a fundamental tension in the relationship between Ofcom as the first external regulator of the BBC and the BBC, which is, I'm not sure for the BBC that they have quite come to terms with having an external regulator. And I think it's interesting, I think it's been the iPlayer discussion we had over the last 12 months, I think is partly a reflection of this. So I think for the BBC there is a sense that the world has changed so dramatically, and that the competition is Netflix and the competition's Amazon, and for the BBC to be regulated for a UK market when they feel that they're a small player in a global market isn't appropriate. And I feel very strongly that the BBC, it's a huge amount of public money. Parliament has set some very important goals for the BBC in terms of distinctive quality content and so on. That actually ensuring that the BBC is doing a great job, but is also not doing a great job that's at an expense of of other players in the UK market, whether that's ITV or Channel 4, is incredibly important.
And I wonder actually, within Ofcom itself, what impact has it had on Ofcom to have taken this on? Because you've suddenly got this extraordinarily extensive sort of portfolio that you have to consider when you look at the BBC in terms of its regulation. Has that shunted the other PSP's a bit down your priority list. I suspect that's one of the concerns that many of them might
Yeah,
have.
no, I think, I have to say personally, I was really, I was always very cautious about taking on the BBC precisely for that reason. Actually, the opposite has happened, and I'm actually much more positive about it than when we started, which is we've now got the ability to look across the whole of the broadcasting market and the broadcasting landscapes. And when we think about news, we can think about the BBC alongside Sky in terms of trust. The BBC isn't some sort of carved out part of the landscape. When we think about diversity or representation, or if we think about competition and where the streamers are with the sort of UK market, or if we're looking at online regulation, the BBC is central to that. And I think actually it has made us, others will probably just judge us, but I think it's made us a better regulator by having the BBC as part of our broadcasting duties.
It's not just got too unwieldy, has it, Ofcom? I mean, I sort of reeled off some of those things that you've had to deal with. We'll talk about the online regulation.
No, there's a lot going on. And there are 850 of us, and I think most weeks I feel actually, given the market's converging so much, and if you're a broadcaster today, actually you've got to think about online, you've got to think about your relationship with platforms, you've got to think about content, you've got to think about delivery. Being able to have a regulatory conversation with the same body is a positive. And then there are definitely days when I think, oh bloody hell, I'm never going to see my kids tonight because you've got 4 or 5 issues running on the go. But overall, I think actually it has worked really pretty well, being able to think both about the way content is being delivered, as well as the content itself.
And just briefly, I know you're having a review of BBC News, so perhaps a couple of headlines, just asking for a friend, of insight into where you might be at, just a couple of insights ahead of the release of that report.
Yeah, and that's coming out sort of later in the autumn. I think, we're doing lots of really interesting focus groups up and down the country. I think I'd probably pull out these 2 themes. So yes, high trust, high honesty. Actually, issues about trust in BBC News, audience say to us, tend to be less about what they see on a BBC bulletin, and actually more to do with actually what else is happening within the BBC. So an issue like a Savile or gender pay actually can feed across into how people feel about the trustworthiness of BBC News. But actually it still continues to be the sort of the go-to place. People would just like the BBC to be a bit less safe and a bit bolder and a bit braver, I think, in its news content. And then when we've looked online, it's a really different story. So young people are bypassing pretty completely BBC Online, and it's because of the platforms they use. The BBC is just less present, or it's present in a much more aggregated way, and so it's a very different story. It's probably a less sort of distinctive offering BBC Online than it is as a broadcast bulletin.
We should touch really on the interim regulation of internet online harm that Ofcom's taken on.
May take on. Being consulted on as we start.
I mean, were you to be the permanent regulator, and that has to be the obvious path, isn't it? I mean, who else realistically is going to do it? I mean, that takes Ofcom onto a whole new level, doesn't it, really?
So if anybody would like to bid for this new job, I mean, at the moment, Nikki's department is consulting on the possibility of Ofcom, at least in the short term, taking on regulation, and it's a very specific segment of the online market. So it's essentially video sharing platforms, so TikTok or YouTube, for illegal content. So it's the sort of, really nasty, difficult stuff, whether that's child pornography or extremism. And I have to say, we're not angling for the job, while at the same time sort of recognising that I think we would, try to make the best fist of it if it does come to us. And there are obviously some relevant skills from some of our work on broadcasting, but also...
But I wonder where else the repository of those skills might actually be, given the scale of Ofcom's work now. I mean, it's almost inevitable that you end up doing it at Ofcom.
I'd say I'm probably the wrong person to ask that question. I mean, what the government has said is that they will either think about an existing body like Ofcom, and as I say, I think, you know, we would aim, if it's us, we'd aim to do it to the best of our ability. Or indeed, I think the alternative is that, you know, one sets up a separate internet body, which obviously, you know, there are pluses and minuses of that, not least in terms of how long that might take to set up. And I think at that stage, of course, you know, you only ever want to take on a job that you think you can do competently, deliver for the public, and for that not to affect the rest of your remit. And I think, you know, it won't be me, but whoever takes my job as chief executive, I suspect that's the first thing on their list of things to think about.
Indeed. Let's just see, we've got a couple of questions before we have a moment of reflection as you depart this industry as its chief overseer and regulators. Anybody? There's one right at the back, at the top. There's a gentleman. If you'd just like to introduce yourself.
Hi, it's Adam Minns from the Commercial Broadcasters Association. Just to pick up on your personal support for a levy, I wasn't quite sure who the sort of online platforms would be, but I think it's worth pointing out that the levy comes to us through AVMS directive, which was driven by a number of countries in Europe who, to be honest, looked with envy at what was happening in the UK, because everyone was investing in UK content and not in Polish content or Republic of Ireland content. And with multi-channel non-PSB broadcasters, with the SVODs, with co-production funding, we have more money going into UK production than we've ever had before. And surely you can see that a levy is potentially a significant dampener on that investment. I mean, margins are not elastic, and in reducing that investment, you're damaging creative competition, you're limiting the number of commissioning gatekeepers that independent producers have, and you're possibly damaging audience choice as well.
So I think that, Adam, I think there's a very specific issue, particularly when you start to move into a world of online regulation as to who contributes to that and who pays. And I don't see any other, I don't see anybody else who should be having their hand up in the air other than the online platforms. I think there's then a question in the context, particularly as we start to think about the future of public service broadcasting and the PSB review, is whether, you know, and as I say, this is very much a personal view, and I suspect lots of my colleagues in Ofcom are about to shoot me afterwards, is to whether, you know, there's a social contract and then there's a responsibility to support, particularly in this short-term period, getting more discoverability. And to be frank, if the government were to legislate on prominence, that's money away from the streamers, because that's a slot that could have been sold, you know, to the highest bidder. So I think inevitably, however you play this, I do think there has to be a contribution from the platforms, whether that's essentially a sort of, you know, benefit in kind because we're going to shift everybody to the, you know, to the right of the, you know, the Samson screen, or whether you do it through other means.
Thank you. I'm very conscious actually that I can see our countdown clock in front of us, and the Secretary of State, who's no doubt on some sort of meter as well, that I probably ought to conclude really with you, Sharon. And I suppose really, I know you didn't want this to be a valedictory interview in any sense, but you are an outstanding example of social mobility, somebody who's cut through so many different glass ceilings. What would you say to the young girl from Leytonstone now, who is setting out to crack a place in this industry? I mean, to go back to those stats on diversity, particularly social diversity, and people from state school backgrounds, from different backgrounds, from homes where parents weren't necessarily in the professions. Just your personal take on that would be really lovely to hear.
I remember the 17-year-old, I think probably thought I was going to be out saving the world somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. I think the difference between, when I think about, you know, what I always regard as a slightly sort of accidental career when I look back, is so much of it is about confidence. And to have confidence to knock on the door, you've got to believe that somebody's going to open the door. And I think, I guess what I would encourage the sort of 17-year-old coming through is to knock on the door, because you'll be surprised at how many people are actually willing your success and willing to support you through and willing to mentor you through. And you know, the fact that I'm sitting here today is a result of probably about half a dozen people who were incredibly kind and generous to me from, you know, my school days through my working life in the civil service and now at Ofcom. So that's what I would, that's what I'd say. And also, it's it's been extraordinarily challenging and it's been extraordinarily fun.
And are you lost to the public sector now? You're off to retail, or do you think we'll see you back at some stage?
You know, it's interesting, John Lewis partnership, because I kind of think if a business were run by the public sector, it would be John Lewis, because you know, it has got the most fantastic ethos, which is about the well-being of the partners who own the business and then customers, and about making sufficient profit. And I mean, that's, to be frank, that's what's attracted me. They've got a very, very strong social conscience and a very, very strong set of values, as well, like the media being, you know, subject to the most tremendous amount of disruption from the global players. So it's going to be very, very exciting.
So we wish you all the very best with the next move. Thank you always for being so willing to come and be questioned here at RTS, to present findings from your reports, and we're very, very appreciative of your time. And I know we're going to hear next all those things that you've lobbed to the Secretary of State. I think you're 6th Secretary of State since your time at Ofcom. Sharon White, we're very grateful for you to come to talk to us.